Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you very much indeed, Sophia, for that very generous and partly fictitious introduction, which shows that I've been around for a long time, and one of the themes of my talk is precisely that. I'd like to thank very much the organisers of ELF7 for inviting me to give this talk, for taking the chance, and for the very warm welcome we've received, and thank you all also for coming here, when I'm sure you have much better things to do, particularly in such nice weather. So I'm going to talk about ELF and the pragmatics of language variation. ELF is a relatively new area of inquiry. It's inspired a great deal of research. The tendency, quite naturally and properly, has been to focus on the contemporary significance of ELF and its relationship to current ideas. But as someone, as I say, who's been around for a long time, and that's evident from what Sophia has had to say, my own tendency is to relate the present to the past and to look for continuities. And this kind of retrospection, of course, can have its disadvantages, but it can also, I think, provide a different perspective which might show the ELF in slightly different light. So while acknowledging the innovative research on ELF that's appeared in DELF and JELF in the recent past, 2011, 2012, 2013, 14, so on, I want to relate this work through publications in 1969, 1970, 1975, 1991. And so provide a kind of synthesis of past and present thinking, and so outline the continuity of inquiry. And in this way, I hope to bring into sharper relief what I believe to be the critical significance that ELF research has for the study of language and language learning in general. So over recent years, a number of publications have made the point that an understanding of language depends on recognizing that it is unstable, dynamic, intrinsically variable, and that the way it's used can't simply be accounted for by supposing that it's a static system of rules that users conform to. And this is often presented as an innovative insight into the nature of language, revealed by postmodernist thinking about performativity, about complexity theory, and sociolinguistics of globalization. And so, a radical departure from previous unenlightened approaches to linguistic description. Now, innovation can, of course, be inspiring. There will always be the tendency for people to be influenced by ideas that are in vogue. But what's innovative is a matter of perception, relative to context of time and place. As now formulated, the idea that language use is variable, adaptive, emergent, may have all the appearance of novelty. But in the disciplines of the social, if not the physical sciences, the idea is really very far from new. Over 40 years ago, for example, long before complexity theory made its appearance, a book was published with the title New Ways of Analyzing Variation in English, 1973. And this is a compilation of papers, all reporting research into inherent linguistic variability. research indeed that conceives of English very much in complexity theory terms as dynamic system that emerges and self-organizes from frequently occurring patterns of language use. This is what this research is all about in 1973. One of the contributors to this volume in 1973 was William Laboff. Indeed, the volume is dedicated to him as recognition of his groundbreaking work on the description of variation in English as a complex adaptive system. And I want to suggest in this talk that a consideration of William Laboff's work, his descriptive work, on the complex and adaptive variability of English can lead us to a very clear understanding of the essential nature of ELF. Perhaps a more direct and clearer understanding than the invocation of complexity theory. In a recent, very interesting article in Delft, Baird and others, his colleagues in Southampton, tell us that, quote, complexity theory provides principles that embody non-fixity, incompleteness, and non-linearity within approaches that are held to be consistent with empirical inquiry of various kinds. Now, Laboff is not referred to in the article, but it is just such principles that inform his extensive empirical inquiry into language variation. Inquiry that made such a mark in the 1970s. Laboff does get a brief mention in the Larson, Freeman and Cameron book on complexity theory, even a nod of approval. Complexity theory, we are told, would find merit in Laboff's approach to the study of variation. I'm sure Laboff would appreciate that. Laboff's way of analysing language was new at the time, precisely because it challenged the established way of thinking about language as essentially an abstract, static model of competence. And he focused attention on features of performance, on how language was actually and variably realized in context of use. This shift of emphasis actually represented a much more radical departure from established ideas about language than did generative grammar, which, as generative grammar, as Chomsky himself acknowledges, follows the same traditional line of de Saussure in restricting the scope of linguistic description to the formal properties of the language system. Now, it's not that Chomsky or de Saussure were unaware of the complexities of language use. On the contrary, it's because language use was so complex and so variable that they believed it to be elusive of systematic description, and so made the methodological decision to exclude it. Laboff's achievement was to demonstrate empirically that there were aspects of complexity that could be systematically accounted for in the linguistics of performance or power. So in the words of what is probably his most cited paper, Laboff's aim was study of language in its social context, and essentially with its variability in use. Now, since ELF research is also concerned with the variability of English in different social contexts, it seems reasonable to suppose that Laboff's work might be of some relevance. And that is what I want to inquire into. The best known of Laboff's work has to do with the variable occurrence of linguistic features and how they correlate with social class and how they reflect social values. His aim is to show that there are variable rules which operate within certain varieties of English. But he's also concerned to assert the legitimacy of these varieties as the means of communication for the communities that speak them. Thus, in the celebrated paper in 1969, The Logic of Standard English, he argues that what was then called non-standard Negro English, subsequently black vernacular, and then African American English, was not, as was commonly supposed at the time, a defective version of the language which made its speakers verbally deprived, incapable of logical thought, incapable of effective communication, but a different version of English, with its own system of rules, and no less cognitively and communicatively effective than standard English within the community of its speakers. Laboff's argument against the notion of verbal deprivation finds its obvious resonance in ELF study. Here too, researchers have had to contend with the fixed idea that uses of English which do not conform to approved standard English norms must necessarily be defective, and its users verbally deprived. They too, ELF researchers, also have had to contend with the educational establishment's insistence that such users have to be shown the error of their ways and subjected to remedial treatment to get them to acquire the proper language. That ELF is just another name for learner English. ELF scholars then share Laboff's view that people are perfectly capable of communicating effectively without conforming to the norms of the standard language. That indeed such conformity may well result in ineffective communication. You can have communication without conformity. So in this case, Laboff and ELF researchers see things in the same way. But there's a crucial difference in that they are not talking about the same kind of people. We say people can communicate without conformity. The people we're talking about are not the same in the ELF context as what Laboff was talking about. Laboff is talking about intra-community communication. People communicating within a particular community. Within a particular community that conforms to the norms of its own distinctive variety. So in so doing, he's seeking to validate black English vernacular, or English American, African American English, as an English in its own right, with its own rules, its own communal conventions of appropriate use. His case for the legitimacy of its departures from the standard rests on the argument that these departures are regular, systematic, and constitute a separate variety. All linguists, he says, who work with non-standard Negro English recognize that it's a separate system, closely related to standard English, but separate from the surrounding white dialects by a number of persistent and systematic differences. Now here, Laboff is making common cause, not with ELF, but with a World English's line of inquiry. Scholars working with manifestations of English in different outer circle countries also recognize these varieties as constituting separate systems with their own, as Laboff put it, persistent and systematic differences. And in this respect, Laboff's paper can be seen as supporting a World English's agenda, a precursor of the WE paradigm. So we can see that this paper is genuinely seminal in that it has within it the seed of two separate developments in the study of variability in English. One of these considers how variable linguistic features constitute a variety associated with a particular community. And the concern here is the validation of a way of using language as the expression of communal identity. So, just as there is a distinctive English that is used for the community of African Americans, which Labov was concerned with, which we might call Ebonic English, so there are distinctive Englishes used by communities in various ex-colonial countries. Indian English, for example. And although these two Englishes are located in different catchment circles, one of them is in the inner, the other is in the outer, Ebonic in the inner, Indian in the outer, their status as independently legitimate means of communal identity is the same. And this status depends on recognizing that the variations that are not in conformity with standard English norms are nevertheless internally regular as to constitute a system in its own way. So that is the World English's line of development. Obviously then, from a World English's perspective, what is of primary concern is the identification of varieties as correlated with communities in the traditional definition of groups of people who share the same primary socio-cultural space. The other line of development is the study of ELF. And this follows from Labov's demonstration that a capability for effective communication is not dependent on conformity to standard English rules and norms. However, what Labov argues is that there is still conformity, but to the rules and norms define a different system, a different dialect or variety. And this is where ELF study parts company with Labov. Because what's clearly evident in the use of ELF is that communicative capability not only does not depend on conformity to standard English norms, it doesn't depend on conformity to the norms of any other variety either. And here, too, is the essential distinction between ELF and WE, World English. The study of ELF considers variability not in terms of variety at all, but as the variable use of English in inter-community communication, as communication across communities. Now, there's a marked tendency for scholars of the so-called WE paradigm to deny the validity of such study. For them, it seems variation is only of significance as evidence of variety. And there really is little point in studying it otherwise. Many sociolinguists appear to share this view. Even when it's deemed worthy of study, ELF is deemed worthy of study, as for example in the work of Edwin Schneider, the unsystematic variation of ELF is really only of interest to the extent that it is an interim phase on the way towards variety status. And variety status is achieved when variations become conventionalized and so settle into what can be taken as a systematic state. In other words, when variation is taken to be regularized to the extent that it constitutes change. But since language, as Labov and the complexity theorists have made abundantly clear, is intrinsically variable, dynamic, emergent, continuously in flux, the identification of a variety depends on supposing that variation is in a state of suspended animation, that it's stopped. In other words, the notion of variety is an ideal construct of convenient fiction. Essentially, when you say variation has become a state, that decision is essentially arbitrary. What ELF study does, I suggest, is to focus on the process of variation itself. on what motivates the varying use of linguistic resources in the achievement of communicative purposes in different contexts of use. I would suggest then that whereas World English clearly follows the socio-linguistic tradition of variety description, with a primary concern for the relationship between language and community, the study of ELF is essentially an inquiry into the relationship between language and communication, how linguistic resources are variably used to achieve meaning. Study of ELF, in short, I'm suggesting, is an inquiry into the general pragmatics of variation. Inquiry into the pragmatics of variation. What would such a pragmatic inquiry involve? I hear you cry. Or not. Generally speaking, as with sociolinguistics, pragmatics has focused attention on language used within particular communities. It's been concerned with how meaning is achieved between parties who share the same lingual-cultural background, who can rely on mutual schematic knowledge to complement the language they use. It's generally the pragmatics of French use, English use, German use. Now, from a pragmatics perspective, language in use serves an indexical function, in that it points to some contextual reality external to language and meaning. Meaning is only achieved when one relates the language to some external context. Meaning is achieved with, this is what I mean by indexical. The language points you to the context which you then engage, once you engage the context, you realize the meaning. Obviously, the more familiar the context, the less language is needed to make the indexical connection. If you share the context with somebody, you often don't need very much language to engage them in the achievement of meaning. So, for example, in speech act terms, if parties share a frame of reference, little language is needed to make an appropriate reference. Similarly, if they share a knowledge of the ways a particular illocutionary act is conventionally expressed, its force can be readily recognized with minimal linguistic effect. It's amazing how much communication can be achieved between people who know each other with little language. Now, this is not to say, of course, that indexical connections are always made as intended, and that intra-community communication always proceeds smoothly. Indexical meanings have often to be negotiated. But the point is that most of the conditions for negotiating this meaning, for effective communication among language users who share the same common or lingual cultural background, most of the conditions are already in place and only need language as an auxiliary means to activate them. We all know this. People that we are familiar with share our interests, values, concerns, our cultures, and so on. Very often we can communicate very effectively with minimal language, because most of the conditions for communication within intra-community communication, the conditions are already in place. They're already there. What one needs to bear in mind is that effective communication does not, therefore, depend on the language itself being precise, but on its being appropriate to context and purpose. So users of a language in a particular community are communicatively competent in that they are aware of the local conventions that regulate their social behavior. They know what Himes refers to as the rules of use in their community. Rules, as Ladov puts it, which show how things are done with words, how one interprets these utterances as actions, In other words, relating what is done to what is said, and what is said to what is done. Rules of use that hold in a particular community, no matter how small or big the community. But these are local rules, and they apply only within the limits of the community. They don't apply, for example, to ELF communication, where there may well be no set of preconceived, agreed, common law conventions that can be taken for granted. No such self-evident lingua-cultural commonality that users can depend upon. This means that there will often be a greater reliance on language to co-construct the necessary pragmatic conditions online and extempore in the very process of communicating. With ELF, we see the use of linguistic forms functioning to pragmatic effect, so to speak, before our very eyes. ELF users have to cooperate to establish common ground, which cannot be presupposed in advance. But they can't do this by simply following the maxims of Grice's cooperative principle. They've got to cooperate. Doesn't mean that they say, okay, one of the maxims of Grice's cooperative principle, will follow them, and therefore cooperate. Because this again presupposes the existence of shared communal values. Grice describes his principle, the cooperative principle, as you know, the cooperative principle. Familiar with this? Make your conversational contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are involved. Now, these maxims of Grice, quantity, quality, relation, manner, familiar with them, I'm sure, they're not, as is sometimes mistakenly supposed, unconditional in their application. They're always related to quote, an accepted purpose or direction of talk. In other words, they are subject to the mutually accepted conventions that define different genre or kinds of communication. So if you're giving a funeral oration, given this is one example, maybe the funeral of the deceased, in accordance with the convention, you don't speak ill of the dead. So you don't tell the truth about the deceased. But you're not flouting the quality maxim, but you're adhering to it, regulating its application as appropriate to the accepted conventional purpose of your talk. The agreed direction and purpose of a funeral oration is set certain conditions which control the application of the maxim. So you tell the truth as required, and the truth as required is that you tell the falsehood. So in that you'd be flouting the maxim if you told the truth. So I say, well, Arthur, as we all know, was a drunk, whose embarrassing company we tried to avoid, especially when he was in his cups and made indecent suggestions to our wives. That is not consistent with the application, the proper application of the maxims. Right? The flouting of a maxim results in what Grice refers to as an implicature, creates an effect. And in the case of the funeral oration, the effect would perhaps be outrage or amusement, if you told the truth. But for all I know, there are communities where it's entirely appropriate to be explicitly frank about the dead and their vices. Maybe there are communities that encourage the funeral oration means you tell the truth, right? As a kind of vicarious confession on behalf of the dead, so as to purify their souls as they go ahead. It's kind of absolution. You tell the truth, the truth of reconciliation. It all comes in. I don't know. The point is that in that case, the maximum of quality would be differently realized. The point is that the recognition of a flouting crucially depends on your knowing how the maxims operate as conventionally appropriate to different kinds of communication in your particular community. If you don't know what these agreed common law conventions are, you can't recognise the flouting. There is therefore no implication. Conversely, if you are ignorant of these conventions, you obviously run the risk of producing unintended implications, creating an effect you wish to avoid. Thus, what you say may be heard as flouting the quantity maxim. And then you're heard to be over-elaborate, verbose, pretentious. Or not familiar with the conventions of idiomatic use current in a native speaker community, you may unwittingly fail to follow the manner maxim, create an unintended comic effect, and find yourself the subject of ridicule. That's not the way you say it. The point is that Grice's cooperative principle presupposes that there are communicative conventions which are familiar to members of a particular community. So the question naturally arises, how do people cooperate, as ELF users do, if they are not members of the same community, so are not familiar with its convention? How does cooperation work when users cannot rely on shared common knowledge upon which the normal operation of the cooperative principle depends? It's apparently very difficult to think of pragmatic processes in dissociation from the way they operate in particular lingua-cultural communities. There seems always to be a tendency to equate these principles with their particular realization and to presuppose conventional normality, as with the cooperative principle. And this is, so it's difficult to think of operation of the cooperative without equating it with how it is actually realized in particular languages in particular communities. And the same is case with the Indian principle, another familiar principle, closely related to the cooperative principle. This, proposed as you know, by John Sinclair, derives from the incontrovertible evidence of language corpora that the texts that native speakers users produce when they communicate consist of recurring patterns, ready-made idiomatic phrases, some of which allow for some internal variation, some of which do not. A kind of formulaic feature of native speakers, the text that native speakers produce. And Sinclair concludes that native speakers, who provide, of course, the data for his corpus, don't compose their text piecemeal, what calls an open choice principle, bit by bit, but by the arrangement of preconceived, prefabricated patterns. And this is how he puts it. The principle in idiom is that the language user has available to him or her a large number of semi-preconstructed phrases that constitute single choices, even though they might appear to be analysable into segments. You can break them into segments, but they're used as a kind of composite. To some extent, this may reflect the recurrence of similar situations in human affairs. It may illustrate a natural tendency to economy of effort, or it may be motivated in part by the exigencies of real-time conversation. But the language users that Sinclair is referring to are native speaker users of English. And with such users, idiom principle finds expression in particular collocational combinations or idiomatic wordings which recur in similar situations in the context of native speaker affairs. When he talks about language user and human affairs, he's talking about native speaker users and native speaker affairs. Here, of course, in this kind of native speaker context, one can see that such wordings make for communicative efficiency, in that whole phraseological units will be signalled by the occurrence of one of its verbal segments. It's a kind of communicative economy. But only, of course, if the users concerned are already familiar with these wordings. But what of users who are not familiar with these wordings? ELF users, for example, who are not using English in the recurrent context of native speaker affairs. If they don't conform to the particular idiomatic wordings that conventionally express the Indian principle in native speaker context, does this mean that their communication, therefore, necessarily lacks idiomaticity? Can you be idiomatic without conforming to the idiomatic wordings of native speaker text? And I would argue that all communication is in accordance with both the cooperative and the idiom principles, whether it conforms to native speaker usage or not. In ELF research, we need to identify the processes whereby these principles are realized in dissociation from the particular lingua-cultural ways in which they are conventionally realized. ELF users, as has been frequently pointed out, have the capability of communicating without conformity to native speaker norms. This means that they find their own ways of being cooperative and being idiomatic online in the very process of interaction. In ELF interactions, the interlocutors cannot depend on shared lingua-cultural conventions. So they have to find common ground by developing their own local conventions in flight, as it were, online, as appropriate to their own context and their own purposes. The transcripts of ELF interactions in, for example, voice, provide evidence of this pragmatic process at work in the immediacy of the interaction itself. We can see how interactions develop a common frame of reference as they go along, picking up, repeating words and phrases, fragments of talk, to bind their discourse together. In effect, creating their own idiom as they go along. Barbara Seidler, for example, has shown how the word endangered is taken up and repeated in new collocational combinations by a group of ELF speakers. One mentions the word endangered, this is picked up later, modified, related to another word, and so on, used as a referential link in the course of the interaction to bind the interaction together. And one line of future research would be to identify the patterns of linguistic regularity that represent this locally emergent idiom of ELF interaction. The idiom that is created online in order to achieve the kind of communicative efficiency that all communication depends upon. The words and phrases that have this idiomatic function will not conform to the idiomatic form of wording in native speaker usage. As again, Seidler was pointed out in a discussion of unilateral idiomaticity, the use of conventional idiomatic forms of native speaker usage may well be idiomatically dysfunctional precisely because they are not mutually recognized. Nor do these local idiomatic expressions that are created online by ELF users have to be in English at all. They may well be drawn from other languages. They may be hybrid forms of significance only for those engaged in a particular interaction. The idiomaticity may be expressed only within that particular interaction, not go beyond it, and be unique to that particular group of speakers. In the case of both the cooperative and idiom principles, when they operate within a particular community, they relate to and depend on mutually known social rules of use, conventions of which constitute appropriate behavior. And so they function to facilitate communication. But they also have an identifying function. an identifying function as markers of community membership. How a particular idiomatic expression to mark you, the use of those mark you as a member of the community. And this is why, when the conventions are not conformed to, when users unintentionally flout a cooperative maxim or get idiomatic workings wrong, they're exposed to outsiders and may well be open to ridicule. It makes it clear that they're not conforming to the cooperative principle or the idiom principle as native speakers do, therefore they're marked as outsiders. In language use within an established community, the communicative and identifying functions are in very close correspondence. In ELF use, they are not. On the contrary, these two functions are intrinsically in conflict. What we see, I'm sorry, distraction. What we see, I'm saying, in ELF communication is the establishment of common understanding, people finding ways of communing with each other, and the emergence, in effect, of a kind of micro-discourse community. Such a common understanding, the formation of such a discourse community, is a microcosm of social communication. It's a variable use of language whose temporary conventions may not survive beyond a particular interaction. But sometimes, of course, the regularities that you establish online within a particular interaction may survive beyond that interaction. And then a particular mode of idiomatizing, a particular variation of use, gets stabilized as conventional in a wider community, either in a primary sense of social community, or in what has been referred to as a discourse community or community of practice. Then, variation gets confirmed as change in that it becomes a variety, a dialect, a register, a world English. But the point is that variation as an essential pragmatic process is continual and needs to be studied whether it eventually stabilizes as a variety or not. And this, I think, is where the crucial significance of ELF study lies. What we see in ELF is the pragmatic process of communication, live, in action, laid bare, so to speak, open to observation. If only we can rid ourselves of our preconceptions based on too much familiarity with the form that this process takes in particular languages or varieties of language, in particular established lingua-cultural communities. It's of course just this familiarity that breeds contempt of ELF. So what we see in actual use is the actual use of what Penfield calls language as social practice. We see it enacted through so we see it as local practice. Language taking shape before our very eyes. Its various forms motivated by pragmatic function as its users appropriate, adapt, exploit the linguistic resources that they have at their disposal. We see how form and function relate, not as an established correlation, but as an ongoing process. And here we make reference to another principle, one which Michael Halliday has proposed, that the form of a language is crucially determined by the communicative functions it is required to serve. As he puts it, this is what we might call the form to function principle. Form is determined by function. particular form taken by the grammatical systems of language is closely related to the social and personal needs that language is required to serve. So this function to form principle is what informs Haraday's systemic functional grammar, where he's concerned with how these communicative functions, the serving of social and personal needs of a particular community, of how these needs have been already conventionally encoded. What he shows is how form and function correlate in English as an established system. But of course, as with the cooperative and idiom principles, this principle of formal adaptability to function continues to apply to all language use. It's not only what has happened before, but it's what is continuing to happen. We can see its historical product in the particular encoded systems of standard English. But these are just one example of the process, just as the particular idiomatic wordings we find in conventional native speaking usage are just examples of the process of idiomaticity. The principle, in the case of the form, as with the other principle, continues to apply in the process of all language use. So when as ELF use, the language is required to relate to social and personal needs other than those served by native speaker English, it will naturally get adapted in various ways that are functionally appropriate to different contexts and different purposes. As with the cooperative and idiom principle, following this function determines form principle will often, perhaps usually, crucially depend on not conforming to the conventional ways the principle has been realized in particular lingua-cultural community. It will depend on not conforming to the normal, as expressed in native speaker use. Haraday talks about his grammar as representing what he calls the meaning potential of English. And this he defines as a systematic resource for meaning. A systematic resource for meaning. So what he's referring to is how meaning is made by conforming to forms that have already been conventionalized and systematically encoded. The realization of meaning potential in his sense is not essentially different from Chomsky's concept of creativity, the infinite exploitation of conventionally established encoding. But again, the coding possibilities inherent in English, as in any other language, are not exhausted by the way they've already been realized. In all uses of the language, we find illustrative, grammatical and lexical expressions, variable encodings that are not sanctioned by established convention, that hitherto that exploit the hitherto unexplored possibilities of what I refer to as the virtual language. And this is what I mean by the pragmatics of variation. And these variations, these departures from the norm, may be accepted as pragmatically appropriate in native speaking contexts of use. This kind of variation happens in native speaking usage. Seen as motivated violations of the Gricean maxim of manner to achieve an effect by creating a new literature. But the same acceptance of non-conformity is not so readily extended to the exploitation of virtual language potential in the use of ELF context. Instead of seeing this as an entirely natural process of pragmatic adaptation, a continuous process, crucial for effective communication, it's on the contrary generally been dismissed as defective communication. And this perverseness is rooted, this is the point I'm making. ELF, as I say, is a microcosm of social communication. This perverseness of refusing to accept the variation of language is as legitimate in non-speakers, non-native speakers as it is with native speakers, is rooted in the persistent failure to dissociate the pragmatics of communication in general from their conventional realization in the assumption that you cannot language without doing it in the established language, that you can't commune unless you do it in the established community. We language and commune all the time, using whatever linguistic resources we have at our disposal. To accept this assumption is to be in denial of the essential reality about human language, that it's intrinsically variable and could not function as a means of communication otherwise. Particular variations may settle into the relatively stable form of variety, and describing such varieties, as world English scholars do, is an entirely legitimate sociolinguistic thing to do. But this kind of sociolinguistic inquiry is completely irrelevant to the study of ELF, which, as I've argued, only makes sense if it focuses on the pragmatics of variation as such. Let me finally say a word about language pedagogy. This focus on the pragmatics of variation, it's this focus that makes the study of ELF of particular potential relevance to language pedagogy. Times have changed, but ideas about language teaching have not changed to keep up with them. Outmoded thinking sustained by the publishing and testing industries and institutionally endorsed by the specifications of the Common European Framework of Reference still perpetuate the old orthodoxy that the objective of learning can only be the acquisition of competence defined as conformity to native speaker norms. Even when the emphasis takes a pragmatic turn and shifts to communication, the focus is not on the communicative use of language, but on how native speakers use it. The objective is still conformity. Now, it's not only that learners have to achieve accuracy by keeping to the rules of standard language, what they have also to learn is how to be authentic, to use language that corresponds with actual native speaker usage. Now that corpus linguistics can provide a detailed description of such usage, the argument goes, learners can and should be taught this real language, the very patterns of native speaker idiomatic wordings that I referred to earlier as essentially irrelevant as far as ELF users are concerned, because they are not appropriate to their context of use. The reality of native speaker usage cannot simply be transferred to classroom context either, and is as irrelevant to the learning as to the use of communicative capability. In both cases, the authenticity of native speaker use cannot be authenticated. So in communicative language teaching, the objective is still conformity. But as research into ELF shows so clearly, conformity and communication do not correspond outside the conventional limits of native speaker context. Indeed, here, in ELF usage, effective communication will depend on non-conformity, on exploiting linguistic resources in creative ways as appropriate to their context. I've argued that the unique advantage of ELF study is that it can give us insights into how communication actually works by the local exploitation of linguistic resources. It seems reasonable to suppose that such insights might suggest a rethinking of what is relevant and realistic as a learning objective. This is all the more reasonable since the orthodox insistence on conformity has, generally speaking, resulted only in failure. For all the teacher's efforts, and for all the shifts and changes in methodological approach and technique, most learners perversely fail to conform. They persist in the error of their ways, cannot, it seems, rid themselves of the pernicious interference from their own language. Why should this be so? Why should learners? Why do learners not conform? Why are they so irritatingly perverse not to do what they're told? No matter what you try, method follows method, approach follows approach, technique, task-based learning, they still persist in order to why. Well, one reason could well be that learners are doing, what learners are doing is acting on the experience of their own language. And so using their English together with their own language as a pragmatic resource, seeking to communicate in a natural way. In spite of the efforts of the teacher to get them to communicate as proper monolingual speakers do, they will seem to naturally seek to communicate as multilingual ELF users do. In other words, we might suggest that the reason for the learner's linguistic abnormality is that they're trying to use the language in a normal, communicative way, with linguistic form determined by pragmatic function. And this would provide some explanation of what has been depicted as perverse learner behaviour. Returning a moment to the idiomatic patterns of native speaker uses that I discussed earlier, Alison Ray, well known for corpus-based description of such phraseological patterns, expresses puzzlement as to why, if these patterns are, as it is very communicatively effective, why learners don't learn them more readily, as she puts it. Why learners do not feel more empowered to harvest L2 input in larger chunks in pursuit of painless routes to effective communication. I mean, if effective communication depends on idiomatic phrasing, why on earth don't these learners learn this idiomatic phrasing to make their communication easier? Right? But it is only a puzzle, of course, if one supposes that the harvesting of such idiomatic chunks does indeed make for effective communication. And as I've argued, on the evidence of ELF, it decidedly does not, because these chunks are relevant to native speaker users, not necessarily anybody else's. If learners instinctively follow an ELF line in their learning, as I suggest they do, they will not see the harvesting of such chunks as increasing communicative empowerment at all. Learner resistance to the imposition of native speaker norms, the instinctive learning along ELF lines, will also explain why so many so-called learner errors are in areas of grammar which have little, if any, communicative value, but only serve an identifying function. It would explain also the resemblance often noted between the linguistic features of much ELF usage with that of learner language. English learners and the ELF users, and the ELF users they will become, both naturally and instinctively put the linguistic resources at their disposal to pragmatic use, and so act on their communicative capability. They enact the variation, pragmatic variation I've been referring to. The difference, of course, is that learners are discouraged where ELF do this without worrying whether they're, for the most part, producing wrong English or not, because they're too busy communicating. The difference is that learners are discouraged from following the same procedures and are forced into a natural conformity. What this means is that the teacher's prescription of competence, in effect, prevents the learner's development of capability. One can only conclude that it's not the learner's own L1 that interferes with the learning of English. On the contrary, reference to the L1 is likely to experience it, to facilitate it. What really, so the L1 will facilitate the experience of the L1 will facilitate the natural acquisition of language as a communicative resource. What really interferes with the effective learning of English as a means of communication is the way it's currently taught and tested. That's the real interference. And it's teaching and testing that define, of course, what counts as learning. Success in learning is not positively assessed in respect to what is learned, but negatively in respect to how far what is learned measures up to what is taught. What is actually measured is teaching success, not learning success. Learners are not so much learners as TGs. The pedagogic relevance of ELF is that it points the way to a genuinely learner-centered approach to English language teaching. Time to conclude. In fact, I'm over time. Am I over time? Time to conclude. In this talk, I've argued that relating the current study of ELF to certain descriptive and theoretical inquiries in the past helps us to identify and explain what is distinctive about ELF as having to do not with the sociolinguistics of language variety, but with the pragmatics of variation. And I've indicated how this perspective relates to current ELF research and its possible development in the future. I've suggested its implications for English language teaching. It's a matter of dissociating communication from its particular realization. Many of the issues I've mentioned, of course, have already been addressed in the ELF literature. My purpose has been to reformulate them within a wider historical context. And in so doing, I wanted to show how present thinking can be informed by past ideas, but also reciprocally how past ideas get revised by present thinking. I wanted to point to the continuity of inquiry. So here we are in the present at ELF7. Last year with ELF6, next year ELF8, and so the inquiry continues. But also I hope, as the inquiry continues, so will the continuity of inquiry. Thank you very much.